Hey everybody, Dustin Cathro here. So you're here on my channel and you probably see the title, and we're here to learn how to build characters for our novels and maybe for our short stories, and maybe this is something that's hindering you from starting. Maybe this is something that you find intimidating to build a complicated character, but fear not, I will help you build a simple but yet effective character for your novel. And really it comes down to three basic principles that I'm going to explain in this video. And I'm going to use some of the examples from my own novel, which is called Hagglethorn Legend of the Grimm. And I'm going to talk about my three main characters in here and how I built them, and how it doesn't have to be this big, intimidating thing to build characters. It can actually be a lot of fun, it can be simple, and you might actually learn something in the process. In my novel, Hagglethorn Legend of the Grimm, I built my three main characters, which are Moondog, Hagglethorn, and Waldorf, based on Sigmund Freud's idea of the psyche. And so there's three components to the psyche, and this is the id, the ego, and the superego. Moondog in the novel, he kind of represents the id, and I mean this in like a very loose kind of way. He's kind of a hedonistic, kind of beastly creature, but he's also kind of beautiful in his primal emotions and his embodiment of these emotions through music. In Hagglethorn Legend of the Grimm, he's a halfling bard who really can capture the essence of the primal energy. And so what I did is I based Moondog on id, and what that kind of meant was that Moondog would have a kind of an appetite for things, and may that be drinking or food. He kind of embodied that kind of beastly feature that we all do have in ourselves. Now, the superego represents the wizard in my book known as Waldorf. And what Waldorf kind of immortalizes is morality and rule. And not just that, but also some deep philosophical principles of what is right and what is wrong. And so Waldorf is this kind of interesting character that is very virtuous and strives for perfection. But the flaw in him is that he's kind of agitated and he's kind of frustrated because he's always living in this unrealistic virtue. And so you find Waldorf in my story gets angry because he's always trying to do what's right, but what's right isn't easy. And so he has to negotiate with himself, and he becomes frustrated very easily when people don't understand where he's coming from, because he's always coming from the superego, the ultimate perfection of what man ought to be. Next is obviously the ego, which is Hagglethorn. He is my main protagonist, and he really represents the combination of both Moondog and Waldorf, and he's negotiating with them all the time in the book of what is right and what is wrong, and he's fighting his deep emotions, but at the same time he's also battling virtue and how he should do what's right. And so something that I also added to Hagglethorn for flavor is he's brave, but he's foolish. And so these are just like very simple concepts that I kind of made these characters out of, but you start unpacking them, and next thing you know, you have main characters for your novel. And I think that this is kind of the main gist of what I'm trying to explain, is that it doesn't have to be complicated. My main characters are based on id, superego, and ego, and it's so easy to do that. And then you add just something that kind of makes sense to them, like bravery, or an appetite of desire, like Moondog, or like Waldorf. He's virtuous, and so because he's so virtuous, he gets angry and frustrated easily because he doesn't get to fulfill these other needs that Moondog is definitely always fulfilling, but that Hagglethorn is always negotiating. And so you can see this as a theme throughout my story. And so I didn't really have to think about this stuff too much. It was just, I always kept in mind when I was writing these characters that they're always trying to embody these things, and at times they cross paths with each other and they slide between, and that's okay. It's kind of like a negotiation with all the characters, how they all are kind of blending in a little bit. but at the same time, they're always going back to what they are. And I think using these three basic principles that Freud made of the human psyche, the layout of the human psyche, is a great way to express your different characters in your novel. You know, people are going to tell you that, oh, you got to build these really complicated characters, but truly, you just have to build characters that people understand when they're reading, and that you can see that they're predictable in a sense. You're like, oh, that's Moondog. He's hungry and he needs to drink some beer. Like, yeah, he definitely does. You know, he's a musician and he likes to embody his emotions and his primal instincts, and so of course he wants to enjoy the pleasures of life because that is Moondog. Something else that you should keep in mind when you're writing your characters are something like, you know, are they the hero? Are they a lover? You know, are they a ruler? Like, are they royalty? And so this kind of brings me to the idea of human archetypes. And so there's 16 common human archetypes. Get ready for this psychology lesson. So the first one is the hero. And then we have the magician, the outlaw, the sage, the everyman, the jester, the lover, the explorer, the innocent, the creator, the ruler, and the caregiver. So all these 16 archetypes are actually found in our own society. And so with a little bit of research, you can kind of read what this means and like what each of them represents. And maybe you want to hone your character in on one of these features. Today, I'm just going to talk about the hero, because in my novel, Hagglethorn Legend of the Grimm, Hagglethorn is the hero, and he's rising to the challenge of trying to stop Hanixiula. And so, though he's this ego character, he's also this hero archetype, where he's going to do what he has to do because he's been thrust into this world and into this situation, and he's going to rise to the challenge. And so the hero archetype is very common in fantasy novels, which is what I love. And I think that if you're writing fantasy, or if you're writing a political fiction or something, you know, the hero is a very common trope that you find in a fantasy novel. Now, for building the antagonist. This is another beast in itself, let alone your main characters, the good guys, let's call them. Maybe you're writing a book that's about bad guys. But maybe we take these same principles of id, ego, and superego, but we just kind of twist them around a bit. So for my character, Hanixiula, in my story, I do something kind of interesting with her. She kind of embodies the superego, just like Waldorf. But what I did was I made what she believes is good as very obviously not good. In the sense that she's sort of disillusioned a bit about what good is. And she keeps doing things for the greater good, as she calls in the book. And there's this idea that she knows what's best. And that is something that I bring with my character, Hanixiula, in Hagglethorn Legend of the Grimm, all the way through. There are points in my novel where Hanixiula, my main antagonist, that you're not really sure if she's good or bad. And this is a kind of a part of trying to define what good and bad is. Since she's embodying the super ego, she has this very virtuous or like patronizing kind of feel to her, and she always knows what's right. But she also instills fear into those around her. And it's not to say that she's totally oblivious to the fear, but she's so caught up in thinking that she knows what's right that she will do anything at all costs to achieve her goal. And this is kind of interesting because then there's this conflict within the story of what is good and what is evil. And everyone thinks they're on the good side. And I guess it's up to the reader really to unpack what I'm getting at. Because there's themes even in our own reality where you're just wondering, whose good is that? Or, whose goals are these really fulfilling? And the play of propaganda in the book is really important for my antagonist, because my antagonist uses propaganda in hopes to recruit people into her ideological ideas of what good is, and to save the people of magic in the realm. That she really stands behind what she believes in, and that she's uncompromising in a lot of ways to do whatever she has to do. And so I think that it's really important to build a relatable antagonist, because I think it's really important for the reader to be wondering sometimes who the good guys are. And I think that's what I was really trying to do in my story, was I was trying to get people to be like, oh, is Hanixiala the bad guy? Or is she actually the good guy? And Hagglethorn, Waldorf, and Moondog are kind of bad news, trying to put a halt to her ambitions. And so I think that that is something that I purposely did. And I think it can be appreciated by the reader. And also it's fun to write that way as well, trying to write from that different perspective. And so I think that building your antagonist and your protagonists, like they're going in separate directions, is really important. But I guess for your antagonist to be believable, you really got to add some spice into it. And I think that you really got to build them up to be something a little more complicated, even more than your heroes in a sense. For example, a big shortcoming of Harry Potter, for example, is Voldemort. Voldemort's just bad because he's bad. There's not really an exact reason except that he wants to be almighty and powerful, but he doesn't really have a lot of character depth as the main antagonist. But flip that around, this might be a common thing that people know, but like Snape in Harry Potter, for example, he's quite a complicated character, and he's kind of like the bad guy for most of the novels, and you kind of see that turn into something else, but he kind of takes that main antagonist role away from Voldemort until the final books. So it's really interesting how some people build their antagonists, but sometimes the antagonist isn't so important. But to me, the antagonist has to be a convincing character, and so I think you have to go back to using the id, the ego, or the superego, and then also the archetypes. The interesting thing about building with id is it's kind of more believable that this big brute that doesn't have any intelligence of the world around them is causing all this chaos and havoc, like King Kong or Godzilla kind of thing. Like, it's a very obvious antagonist, and you don't have to build it very deeply to understand that, oh, this is a beast. So it's not like, depending what kind of story you're writing, you might want a more simple antagonist compared to a more sophisticated antagonist. So as someone that has built a sophisticated antagonist, I would say that it takes a lot more work than building a Godzilla or a King Kong kind of thing. And there's a lot more intrigue, I think, in building the complicated antagonist. And I'm using complicated pretty loosely here, guys. It doesn't have to be, like I said, you just use id, ego, superego, use an archetype and kind of stick to it, but twist the morals a bit. Twist what they believe a bit. Make it kind of like, ugh, like you do that, but make it seem like they are doing the right thing from their perspective. Now that I gave you kind of a basic understanding of how I built the three main characters in Hagglethorn Legend of the Grimm, I can kind of see how some people might be a little bit intimidated by these things, because Sigmund Freud is a huge name in psychology, but using his ideas of like id, ego, and superego, and then also using the idea of archetypes, which is more of a Carl Jung thing, and kind of blending them together to build a character that seems somewhat realistic but also effective, I think is really important. So I think there's a little bit of research that's needed to be done. For example, just like the ego, and then also with the hero, which is a very common idea in fantasy. I think that you can build a character. So I'd be curious to hear some feedback from anyone, and how you build characters, or how you're going to build your character using these kind of simple methods that I've laid out. So please feel free to leave some feedback, and let me know how you feel when you build your character using these simple ideas and then adding some spice in it, make someone brave, or make someone have a weird quirk. Maybe they twist their mustache before they go to battle or something. These little types of things add a lot of character and flavor to books, but the meat and potatoes of it really needs to be consistency, and it needs to be predictable in a sense. The characters, not the storyline, but the characters, they need to behave. They have to behave with some prediction. You want the reader to be reading and be like, oh yeah, that's definitely what that character would do. Of course that's what they would do. Or of course they tricked them. Maybe they're very smart and wise. Like Waldorf, for example, in my story, all the time pulling little tricks on everyone that they don't even know are happening until they unfold later. And you're like, oh, well, that makes sense. So I think just adding spice when you can to your character is important. But the meat and potatoes is the consistency in the character and how they act and define themselves. So keep that in mind. Please give me some feedback, guys. Try to build a character using the methods that I build mine on. Let me know how it goes. Any feedback would be great. Thank you. Till next time, guys.